Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host. And for the next little while, I'm going to be telling you about some things, commenting on some things I think you might be interested in, hopefully. If you have any reactions to the show, I do welcome them. You can send them to me directly. This is my personal email, whoviating, WHOVIATING @AOL.com. If you can catch that, go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be like here several times during the show. You can go there, you can get the email address from there if you can catch it, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, just two things as always: include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I stink at answering my email. All right, with that, let's get to it. I usually like to start with some good news, but I didn't really find any this week. So I'm including this just to start with something a little light, something maybe just for the fun of it, okay? So at the halftime show at the Super Bowl, Beyonce in her performance sort of nodded to the Black Lives Matter movement and to the Black Panthers, which, like the Super Bowl, is just about 50 years old. And this just outraged the right wing. They were outraged, I tell you. I mean, how dare she? Rudy Giuliani, he of a noun, a verb, and 9/11, blustered that it was an attack on cops. Now, parenthetically, he also said that Super Bowl halftime entertainment should be wholesome, which I suppose would be true because it is, after all, sandwiched between two 30-minute time segments of made-for-TV concussions. But anyway, he was outraged. In fact, some outfit called Proud of the Blues Civilian Fleet, with blues meaning cops, of course, issued a call for a protest. Beyonce's performance was a race-baiting stunt, they said. It was hate speech and racism. It was a slap in the face to law enforcement. And the Black Panthers are a hate group. They encouraged everyone to protest this grievous affront by picketing the headquarters of the NFL in New York City on Tuesday, February 16th. Wear blue, attendees were told. Wear as much blue as possible. Oh, the buzz that this generated, all the discussion, and the buzz built until D-Day when, according to Glenn Schuck, he's a news anchor for New York City's all-news radio station, 1010 Wins, this was the scene. A total of 2 anti-Beyonce protesters straggled in over time, heavily outnumbered not only by the pro-Beyonce counter-demonstrators across the street, but by the number of news outlets that came to cover the event. Actually, I suppose I should say there were 3 anti-Beyonce protesters, if you include the one who wound up pretty much agreeing with and expressing sympathy for the concerns of the pro-Beyonce demonstrators, counter-demonstrators across the street. Now, some of the anti-Beyonce crowd is now claiming that the call for a protest, this was a hoax, which admittedly is possible, but still doesn't explain why none of those anti-people showed up. What this means ultimately is that we still do not know the answer to the question from the 60s, what if they gave a war and nobody came? But we do know the answer to the question, what if the reactionaries called for a protest and nobody came? This is the kind of thing the word fail was invented for. All right, still trying to keep things a little upbeat. We have a Hero Award. A Hero Award is something we give out here occasionally for people who just do the right thing on a matter big or small. And this time it's a joint award. It's going to 2 young Australians, Nick Marchesi and Lucas Pratchett. And in the photo, Nick is the one to your left. In 2014, they came up with a simple but actually brilliant idea. It was to improve the health standards and the self-respect of homeless people in their home city of Brisbane. It began with an old van, a generator, and most importantly, a washer and dryer. With that, they founded Orange Sky Laundry, a free mobile laundry service for homeless people. The pair had previously worked in a food van delivering food to the hungry, realized that there were mobile organizations that dealt with getting food to people in need, getting medical care to people in need, but there was nothing that simply would help people maintain clean clothing, and they set about to fix that. In time, in fact, in no time, the program expanded so dramatically that they now have 5 vans covering a total of 36 sites in 5 cities across Australia. They have 270 volunteers, and they wash and dry something over 350 loads of laundry a week. You know, it's one of those things we don't think about often. One of the hidden burdens of homelessness and poverty, something we take, a simple thing we take for granted, like putting on a clean shirt, is something that actually in reality is denied to so many people. Now, this Orange Sky Laundry, by the way, the name comes from a song called Orange Sky by Alexei Murdoch. Does Orange Sky Laundry provide a home for the homeless? No, of course not. Does it provide some dignity to the homeless? Yeah, absolutely. In recognition of their work, Pratchett and Marchesi just became the first ever joint winners of the Australian of the Year award. And now they are talking about going global. They intend to introduce the service to Europe next month and to the US later in the year, where it will no doubt be disparaged by many as just some sort of scheme to encourage dependency. Well, that doesn't matter. Nick Marchesi and Lucas Pratchett are, without doubt, they are heroes. All right, next up. Okay, so this happened. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, known unaffectionately around here as Judge Skeletor, died on February 13th, apparently of natural causes. He was 79. And as much as I disliked and, in fact, am tempted to say despise the man, know right here and now that I am not going to celebrate his death. As John Donne wrote, and I'm quoting, partly quoting here, "No man is an island entire of himself. Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. I celebrate the death of no one." But then again, even though it is also said that one should not speak ill of the dead, like Mark Antony here, I come to bury Scalia, not to praise him, although unlike Mark Antony, I actually mean that. I mean, I've been mystified for some time as to why people, supposedly intelligent people, kept describing Antonin Scalia as having this brilliant mind. I mean, I found his rulings, those of them that I read, admittedly that there wasn't a lot, I didn't read lots and lots of his rulings, but those that I did read, and particularly in the case of his dissents, I found his rulings to be plotting and uninformative. They're written with a bludgeon, when a rapier would be the more effective weapon, and they were uncreative, even in the sarcasm and witticisms that supposedly punctuated his writings, with the former of those being nasty and sneering rather than incisive, and the latter plotting and thudding rather than revealing. Now, that he had an effect on American jurisprudence, that he affected the way the laws and the courts have shaped our present predicaments, that's unquestionable. That his effect has been any way positive is baloney. His advocacy of textualism, and this is the argument that you should look to the actual words of a law rather than to, for example, legislative history to resolve questions of the law's meaning, that in and of itself is inoffensive. But the extreme ends to which he put that principle, where what he claimed was the plain meaning of a given part of a law, which, if it was really that plain, why is it the subject of a legal dispute? But what he claimed was the plain meaning of a law that he saw had to stand even if his interpretation was in direct contradiction to legislative history and committee hearings and so on. that kind of rigidity speaks less to a commitment to a principle and more to a mindset. It speaks more to arrogance. To arrogance, where his understanding is, of course, the indisputably correct one, and it also speaks to an intellectual laziness and unwilling to grapple with nuance. Even worse than that was his fanatical embrace of originalism, or original intent. The idea that the provisions of the Constitution should be understood and interpreted in the way they would have been understood and interpreted when the document was adopted 227 years and some months ago. That is, we have to live by the social and moral precepts of over 2 centuries in the past, and a broadened or deepened understanding of human rights or justice developed in that time is irrelevant to the Constitution. He once declared that the idea of a living Constitution, the idea that allows for changing interpretations as society changes and hopefully matures, he once referred to that idea as, quoting, dead, dead, dead. All right, so let's run down some of his greatest hits to get a sense into what dark spaces his rigidity of thought led him. For one thing, if he had had his way in a 2005 case, the U.S. would have maintained its position as the only Western nation to legally execute juveniles. Fortunately, he lost that one. In 2009, in a stunningly amoral dissent, in the case of a convicted murderer who was seeking a new trial based on the uncovering of new evidence and the recanting of the witnesses against him, he wrote, quote, "This court has never held that the Constitution forbids the execution of a convicted defendant who has had a full and fair trial, but is later able to convince a habeas court that he is actually innocent." In other words, what he's saying is that even if we now know you're innocent, hey, you had your trial, so we're going to kill you anyway. His fanaticism extended to religion. Back in 2004, the court found that just because a government program subsidizes a secular activity, that does not mean it's constitutionally required to also subsidize the equivalent religious activity. Scalia claimed in dissent that this amounted to, quoting, discrimination against a religious minority, the religious minority in the case being Christians. More recently, he was part of the 5-4 majority in the Hobby Lobby case, the one that allowed at least some private employers who claim religious scruples, religious objections, to deny birth control coverage and the health insurance for their employees despite the requirements of the Affordable Care Act. On at least 2 separate occasions, he has declared in a speech that the First Amendment provides for freedom of religion, but not for freedom from religion, that the government can favor religion over non-religion. Meaning, to put it differently, that if you are an atheist or agnostic or a follower of some non-theistic philosophy or in any other way non-religious, he says you can be denied full participation in American society with the blessing of the Constitution. Perhaps connected to this, his disdain for LGBTQ rights is almost legendary. In 2003, when the Supreme Court struck down sodomy laws, he called it surrendering to the homosexual agenda, quote unquote. He compared laws against homosexuality to laws against murder, incest, child pornography, and bestiality. When the court struck down central parts of the so-called Defense of Marriage Act in 2013, his dissent charged that the majority had thus labeled the act's supporters as, quote, members of a wild-eyed lynch mob and enemies of the human race. And he claimed that Obergefell v. Hodges, this is the case that struck down laws banning same-sex marriage, he said that that case was a threat to democracy. In 2013, he was part of the majority that ripped the heart out of the Voting Rights Act, which he called a perpetual racial entitlement. He was a reliable vote on the court to limit, curtail, or undermine affirmative action programs of any sort, capped by, and perhaps explained by, his bigoted assertion from the bench this past December that affirmative action programs in college admissions were actually hurting minority students by getting them into better schools where they do not do well, and how it would be better for them if they went to a less advanced school. He was also a faithful friend of corporate rights and privileges, including such as the notorious Citizens United decision, and earlier this month his dissent, happily, it was dissent in a case that actually blocked a corporate attempt to derail class action suits. Now, sometimes his decisions were just bizarre, or as when he argued in a 2012 case that individual states are entitled to their own immigration laws, which, if it means anything, means at minimum that states can tell certain groups of people you can't live here and can send border patrols to control entry in and out of the state. To give you an idea of what I thought of the man and his supposedly great legal mind, one of these cases involving religion prompted me to call him that beacon of buffoonery, that incubator of inanity, that epicenter of egregiousness. In response to his comments about affirmative action, I said he had once again proven himself an embarrassment to his position and an affront to reason. And I described his dissent in Obergefell v. Hodges as, like most of his opinions, quite Shakespearean. That is, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, this is not to say that Antonin Scalia was invariably wrong. I did agree with him sometimes. It just said he was like the old joke about the broken clock. So, I am sorry he's dead. I am sorry and have sympathy for the pain and the loss that his family is going through. But although I have to say that I would much, much, much rather this had been done through retirement, I will not for a moment pretend that I am anything other than pleased that he is no longer doing damage to our society from his perch on the Supreme Court. Let's take a break. And we are back. There was one other case I wanted to mention, in which Antonin Skeletor, brought his baleful gaze to bear, and it had predictably bad results. It was a 2008 Heller decision, more properly called District of Columbia v. Heller, the one in which the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Scalia for the first time in U.S. history, declared that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to own a gun. It was a thoroughly mendacious decision that not only ignored decades of precedent, but engaged in precisely the sort of living constitutionalism Scalia claims to abhor. And it completely wrenched the amendment into little pieces. At first, it claimed that the whole passage about a well-regulated militia was merely prefatory and had no legal meaning. And then split the phrase keep and bear arms into two unrelated parts, one about keeping and one about bearing, which decision has led more or less directly to our recent experiences of white guys and a few equally white women walking around with semi-automatics slung over their shoulders and Glocks strapped to their hips, smirking about how no one could stop them because it's my right. And by the way, parenthetically, you surely know why I specified that all of these people are white, right? All right. So the point is, bear all that in mind. In considering a report by researchers from the University of Nevada, Reno, and the Harvard School of Public Health, which was recently published in the American Journal of Medicine. It used World Health Organization data to compare gun violence and murder rates across 23 developed or high-income nations, as they're also called, including the United States. And the results, I don't know what to call them, shocking, depressing, I don't know what to call them. Among the findings are that Americans are 25 times more likely to be violently killed with a gun, that is murdered, than those in those 22 other nations. We are 6 times more likely to be accidentally killed with a gun, 8 times more likely to commit suicide with a gun, and overall 10 times more likely to die by gun than residents of other developed nations. Homicide is the second leading cause of death for Americans aged 15 to 24. It's the third leading cause of death among those 25 to 34. Americans 15 to 24 are 49 times more likely to die by gun murder than similarly aged young people in other developed nations. For those aged 25 to 34, the risk is 32 times greater. Despite having only half the total population of those other 22 nations studied, the U.S. accounted for 82% of all firearms incidents. What's more, the U.S. accounted for 90% of all women, 91% of all children aged up to age 14, and 92% of youth ages 15 to 24 who were killed by a gun, either through murder, suicide, or accident. Bottom line, in the words of lead author Erin Gertstein of the School of Community Health Sciences at the University of Nevada, Reno, quoting, the U.S., which has the most firearms per capita in the world, suffers disproportionately from firearms compared with other high-income countries. In other words, she said, our guns are not protecting us, they are killing us. And the question now for us is how many more people have to die before we as a nation finally come to our senses. Here's a footnote to that, by the way. On January 1st, an open carry law went into effect in Texas. But things might not be going quite the way the gun nuts were imagining. A number of private sites and businesses, notably the Houston Zoo, have stepped up to say that they will not allow open carry guns on their premises. But perhaps most notably, the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, and what it says is, quoting, an effort to provide a safe environment and promote a family-friendly atmosphere, has announced it will not allow any guns, concealed or open carrier, into the event. And of course, this has added importance because of the whole rodeo thing and evoking the mystique of the cowboy and all the gun associated with that. Meanwhile, at the same time this is going on, in order to comply with state liquor laws, Walmart is having senior clerks ask anyone who enters one of its Texas stores that sell alcohol and who is carrying a gun to produce the paperwork proving that the gun is licensed. Now, of course, the gun nuts groused about being treated like a suspect, and one woman complained, the whole time I felt like I was looking over my shoulder. I should not be stopped for something that I'm not doing something wrong. Yeah, well, consider yourself lucky, ma'am. Instead of a white woman with a Burst of Thunder 380 pistol strapped to your hip, you could have been a black boy with a toy. All right, last for this week. Researchers at UCal San Diego are working on a study that so far shows that every sentient being who was not a right-wing ideologue already knew, and frankly most right-wing ideologues already knew, but they knew it was better for them to lie about it. Voter ID laws do depress voting rates among minorities, particularly those of Latinos, and disproportionately affect Democratic voters. That is, they are a program of trying to rig elections in favor of the reactionaries by keeping more liberal-minded people from being able to vote at all. The report's technically a working paper, but it was based on research led by political science professor Zohan Hajnal and assisted by Nazita Lajavardi, a PhD candidate in political science at the university, and Lindsay Nielsen, a postdoc there. Now, the thing is, there have been some studies that have indicated that voter ID laws have an insignificant effect on turnout, including among minorities. But in their paper, the authors noted some serious deficiencies in these studies, not the least of which was that only one of them is less than 6 years old, which means they were largely done before the wave of voter ID laws that followed the Supreme Court's approval of an Indiana photo ID law in 2008. And more importantly, they preceded the wave of strict photo ID laws, those that the authors defined as, quote, ones that prevent the voter from casting a regular ballot if they cannot present appropriate identification, unquote. In addition, these earlier studies relied on self-reported voting statistics. That is, figures derived from polls asking people, who did you vote for? or rather, I should say, there was polls asking people, did you vote? I should have said. Now, such figures, those polls are notoriously unreliable because people, and the literature indicates this is particularly true of minorities, people over-report their own voting histories. Well, of course they voted. Everybody votes. Of course they voted. So instead of that, the researchers used more recent and more reliable data, the data coming from the validated vote numbers from the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies. Significantly, they also checked the results over a large number of election cycles, over 50 at least, over the period 2006 to 2012, and apparently this is the first time it's been done over so many election cycles over such an extended time. Okay, so after controlling for almost every factor other than these laws themselves that could affect voter turnout, what did they find? In a nutshell, in the words of Lajavardi, quote, where strict voter ID laws are enacted, racial and ethnic minorities are less apt to vote. In general elections, states with strict photo ID laws show a Latino turnout 10.3 percentage points lower than in states without them. The law also affected turnout in primary elections, with Latino turnout decreased by 6.3% and black turnout by 1.6%. But it gets worse because they also did something else those earlier studies avoided. Not just the absolute change in turnout, but the relative change in turnout between minority voters and whites who were largely unaffected by voter ID laws. In primary elections, the gap between Latino and white turnout nearly tripled in states with these tough laws, from 5 points to 13.3 points. The gap between black and white turnout nearly doubled in primaries, from 4.8 to 8.5. The effect on Latinos carried over to general elections, where the turnout gap more than doubled, from 5.3 to 11.9 percentage point gap. What's more, very likely as an effect of the kind of people whose ability to vote has thus been hindered, the research also showed that in strict photo ID states, the turnout gap in general elections between Republicans and Democrats doubled from 2.3 points favoring the Republicans to 5.6. So, enact photo ID laws. Suppress minority turnout? Check. Suppress Democratic turnout? Check. Rig the system in favor of the really right wing? Double check. Now, the right wing will surely try to dismiss these results while continuing to screech and whine about the essentially non-existent crime of in-person voter fraud, which is the only type of crime that these laws could impact. But behind closed doors, I have no doubt that they are reading the author's paper and reading the results with glasses of champagne in their hands. Okay, that's it for this week. We will be back. Now remember, we're taking the last week of each month off, so we will see you back here in 2 weeks, okay? 2 weeks. In the meantime, comments, responses are always welcome, whoviating@aol.com. But for now, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.